everyone. We will call our first meeting of the Technical Working Group on Innovation, Technology, and Renewable Energy to order. This is the time and place when our meeting has been noticed. Is it really echoey for you? Do I need to have it farther back? It just sounds really echoey. I'm going to go ahead and have staff up in Carson City do a roll call, if that's okay.
Okay, this is Ryan Cherry for the record. Dana Bennett let us know in advance that she would be absent for this meeting. So can I hear from Chairman Taylor?
Present.
Adam Kramer?
Present.
Daniel Witt?
Present as well.
And Steve Hill.
And I'm here too.
Okay, we have a quorum.
Great, thank you, Mr. Cherry. So I want to thank all of my fellow committee members for agreeing to serve on this committee. I'm really excited that we get to serve together and that I get to serve with some of Nevada's leaders in technology and innovation. And I'm really excited about the work we're going to get to do on this working group. So thank you all for your time and commitment. And I see folks both in Carson and in Las Vegas, and we're really glad that you've all come out to attend this meeting and to be part of our discussions and part of our work. We're going to follow our very short agenda as it was noticed, and we'll close item number 1 now, and we'll move to item number 2, and that's public comment. Are there any members of the public that would like to address the Committee on Energy Choices Technical Working Group on Innovation, Technology, and Renewable Energy? We'll start here in Vegas. Is there anyone? Okay. Any members of the public in Carson City that would like to address this working group? All right. With that, then I will close out item number 2. Item number 3 will be the consideration of election of a vice chair. I'd be happy as chair to open up nominations for this position, and I would like to exercise my prerogative to open up the nominations by nominating Steve Hill as vice chair, but of course I'm open to other suggestions for vice chair. Any other nominations? Okay, could I get a second for the nomination of Steve Hill as the vice chair for this working group?
Adam Kramer for the record. I second the nomination.
All right, thanks, Adam. So I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right, thank you so much, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for the votes, and thanks to Steve for being willing to serve in the vice chair position. And I promise, Steve, I will do my best to be at every single meeting so that the burden of being vice chair is de minimis. But I really appreciate your willingness to serve. So then finally,
your willingness to get that on the record.
I thought you would appreciate that. Was there any other comments or acceptance speech that you would want to make? I'm just joking. All right. So I'm going to close item 3 now that we have a vice chair selected, and I'm going to move to item number 4, which is a discussion of really how this committee is going to work and how we want to move forward. Specifically, we need to discuss issues for further consideration and get some direction from the 3 of you with the fantastic expertise that you bring to this working committee on what areas we need to examine and how we want to take care of that. I do want to say that one of the things that I think is really great about this working group is the fact that we really get to be at sort of the forefront of the discussion of how we move our energy market forward and how we help cement the vision that the governor has for a new Nevada, and that includes all of these great clean technologies and innovative technologies that Tesla's working on, that Switch is working on, that Steve has really brought to the forefront of how we do economic diversification and development. And so I'm really looking forward to y'all's input on this. One of the things I think we do need to address is the recent amendment to the executive order that established the Committee on Energy Choice to start with. And that amendment was from last week. And it had the addition of the Renewable Portfolio Standard and community solar or solar gardens as things that we needed to consider. So what I thought that we could do is also talk a little bit about the intersection between this committee and the other working groups, and really this committee and the specific things that we've been tasked to look at and how they sort of intersect with one another. And I think that our committee is going to be one that is going to be fairly nimble, because as things come up from the other working groups, there may be items that they need to hear from us on how something might work or how something might integrate. So I anticipate that that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep in mind as we move forward. So what we have on the agenda is a list of 8 specific categories that we are going to be looking at moving forward and providing recommendations to the full committee, and then again trying to integrate some of those recommendations into things that may come up from the other working groups. One of the other things that we're going to need to look at, though, as we do this is not just the category itself and the technology itself, but what are going to be the requirements to utilize that technology or integrate it into our market, what entities are going to be responsible for implementing or making sure that there's compliance with those requirements, what agencies are going to be responsible for administration and oversight, and then some of the cost and funding sources for those categories. So what I'd love to do is, and I think sort of weird talking to you guys on the phone and not having you here, but that's so just bear with me while I kind of talk and think. But one of the things I think that we're going to have to really consider is, what are the priorities of some of these technologies? What are the things that we know are going to really make a difference in terms of innovation and technology in renewable energy development? And what are those primary pieces that we probably should look at for immediate kind of consideration and work through on presentations and recommendations? So I was hoping that we could kind of go to the other members of the committee and get some of your thoughts on the items that are listed from your positions and from your work that you've done. And if you don't have the agenda in front of you, I hope you do, but if you don't, the 8 categories are the RPS, grid infrastructure, energy efficiency programs, aggregation programs, which would include community solar as something to consider, incentive programs, which could be anything from, and we need to decide if we're looking at sort of consumer incentives, but more likely technology incentives and innovation incentives. New technologies, which really would encompass one of the primary things I think that we should be looking at, which is storage, as well as other items like smart cities, transportation electrification, autonomous vehicles, and some of those other great programs and policies and missions that the governor has set forth as what he sees for Nevada moving forward. Then number 7 would be demand side management programs, and number 8 would be distributed energy resources. So with that in mind, if that's okay with you all on the phone, I would love to just kind of do a quick inventory of what your thoughts are in terms of prioritization, potential programmatic work that we need to look at, concerns that you might have with any of the items, and just a quick talk about the topics from your perspective. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is Daniel Witt. For the record, I think one thing that I'd like to sort of point out, which frankly other members of the committee may already be well familiar with, is that with the legislative session closing, there were a number of bills related to Nevada's energy future that ultimately did pass and were signed by the governor. You already mentioned several topics that sort of are encompassed within that regard, but I would sort of draw everyone's attention to the fact that there's now a schedule that's been put forward for the PUC, and for which the PUC is actively, I believe, recruiting additional resources to fulfill around several of these topics, specifically a distributed resources plan that I believe has to be put into effect sometime in early 2019, an integrated resources plan which takes into account those distributed resources, which follows that, and something that actually precedes that. It would be the study and implementation of some kind of target for the deployment of storage at different parts of the grid. So even as we're considering all of these topics under the auspices of this initiative, I think it's worth just pointing out how much the state is already planning to do that can be wrapped into and will precede in many ways a lot of the implementation of anything that comes out of the commission or any follow-on legislation related to choice.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And that is a very good thing to highlight because there were a lot of charges to the PUC out of bills that were passed. From your perspective, Daniel, was there anything within that list of items that you wanted to comment on as well in terms of how you think those might overlap with other committees or within the list itself in terms of how we take a look at those categories and how we look at potential presentations and recommendations moving forward on all those implementation pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, to your point earlier, I think new technologies is something where that will come out of that will be, I think, a response to discussion and any discourse that occurs as a result of some presentations that probably haven't occurred yet. It sort of, to me, is a catch-all for where there may be a tough nut to crack, and invariably we look at technology as an opportunity to bridge any divide that might exist today, or may be able to look at lessons learned from any prior efforts to open up the market. Distributed energy resources. I think the reason that I focused on the PUC is just because there's such an intensity of focus on that from the PUC that I expect that some of it may very well be worth a presentation from the PUC just on the number of activities that they've been charged with undertaking as a result of the legislative session, given that touches on several aspects of this, most notably distributed energy resources, and for that matter, energy efficiency programs. As you know as well, at the top, the charter has been adjusted slightly to address the renewable portfolio standards. I believe we heard testimony from several presentations already in response to questions from Assemblyman Brooks about the need or lack of need for RPS as it relates to and how that's impacted by energy choice. I expect that will also be a continuing topic of discussion, and we may very well have opportunities to weigh in on that. In part, if for no other reason than the last draft of, if we use the last draft of the legislation as some guidance. Even though that went through that legislation ended up being vetoed, there was a lot of discussion about the incorporation of advanced technologies and how you might spur the installation of several of the technologies, which in and of itself, I believe, may be construed as an incentive program. So I think that many of these things many of these topics that we're discussing today, as soon as you touch one, you probably touch two or three, just by virtue of where the policies have gone to date and where perhaps the near-term opportunities are.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. And then good point about the PUC coming and talking about everything that they're charged with. Is it worth doing a quick review as well of the what the Interim Energy Committee is going to be looking at so that we can see where there's opportunities for synergy with their work, trying not to duplicate, seeing how we can make sure that we're giving good, robust recommendations through to what they're doing as well? Because we could possibly have the bill sponsor come and talk about that.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation, but to the point that you made about trying to create some efficiencies so that we're not necessarily duplicating efforts, I think that would hold a lot of value.
And this is Adam Kramer, for the record, and I would agree with that. I think that what's interesting in looking at the direction from the committee on kind of the 8 key areas to discuss is I think a point Daniel brought up, which is when you touch one subject, you touch a lot. And so I think that one of the things that would make or help maximize the efficiency of the work of this subcommittee in particular would be to focus on the highest level items that touch the most amount of innovation or advanced technology, if you will. One of those that strikes me, obviously, would be the grid itself, and the grid serving as the point where everything plugs into or comes off of in terms of key infrastructure that promotes innovation. And what I would think would be a fascinating point of discussion is to discuss the grid and to discuss how the grid looks and is operated in a open and competitive retail energy choice market. And with that being said, looking at things like independent distribution system operators. So removing what in most markets where the utility is the transmission and distribution company, and having utility that only does transmission and having competition on the distribution side. I know former FERC Chairman John Wellinghoff had worked on a paper and really fascinating that's gotten a lot of really positive response along with Dr. Tong about this, and I'd love to delve into that more. And the reason that I bring this up again goes back to the fact that I think that when you talk about the innovations that companies like Tesla are bringing to the table, companies like K2 and Henderson, companies that the state of Nevada looks to continue to attract from an economic development perspective, and their willingness to move at the speed of technology, we need to have a grid infrastructure that allows it. And as the committee tasked with innovation and technology, that's probably, in my opinion, a good starting place for us.
Okay. So, Adam, within that discussion about the grid, where do you see? I mean, because I have in my mind where I think some of the pieces of the list of 8 items would fit, but obviously things like storage and DER. But what else do you think in terms of that idea of maximizing a discussion of many topics within one topic? What else do you think could fit in there?
I think that new technologies fit in there. Okay. I think exactly what you said, DER and the demand-side management programs kind of probably tie a little bit into that because of how you would manage an IDSO, which I think would ultimately fall to a PUC or maybe even a new organization under a PUC. And then even potentially aggregation programs because of how you would do the distribution on that, because the aggregation programs could end up fitting into things like microgrids, could fit into different distribution outlets altogether. So maybe you could put 3 or 4 under a larger umbrella of grid infrastructure, and then obviously, renewable portfolio standard and energy efficiency programs have a lot of overlap, as you know probably better than anybody on this committee with the work you've done over the years, and it ties in very well to incentive programs as well.
Okay. And then, Steve, I hate to put you on the spot, but I just wanted to make sure if you had any thoughts that you had a chance to sort of chime in, especially in terms of some of the things that are in the governor's strategic framework and in your work and your diversification sectors in under GoEd. Was there anything that you thought made sense from the list of 8 categories or from any of the governor's executive order language that should be a focus initially or that you have a concern with?
Can I answer a different question?
You can do whatever you want to, Mr. Hill.
So actually, I've got a couple of questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
One, I try and start to the extent possible thinking about this in terms of what the end work product looks like and how we fit into the Energy Choice Committee as a whole, and what the Energy Choice Committee's end process or end product is intended to be. So, in the last task force, there were kind of individual recommendations made on a bunch of subjects. Is that kind of what our subcommittee intends to do, or is this intended to be more of a comprehensive, here's everything and here's how we think this all fits with an overall energy choice plan? I mean, I'm kind of putting you on the spot. You may not know yet.
I think it's a very good question, and it's a good point of discussion. And when I was on the technical advisory committee for the task force, we did take specific topics and figure out, was there a policy recommendation that needed to go forward that could be wrapped into a bill, for example. I sort of look at this working group, and I feel like the other working groups would have the same vision as saying, we know a couple of things. We know that the governor has said he wants an energy market that is a net exporter, that leads on clean energy, that uses our renewable resources, that leads on electric vehicles. We have some direction for what our governor wants policies in the state to look like. We also have some very specific direction from Nevada residents and from our larger community, and that is that they wanted energy choice, and they voted overwhelmingly for it. And so how do we provide them meaningful choices that also match the governor's vision for a new Nevada, and again, the fantastic work that you've done in diversifying our economy and bringing companies like Tesla and Switch to the fore and making sure that they're helping to innovate and develop in a state. So I think that there are pieces of what we're going to talk about that would require a specific recommendation in terms of how it moves forward, whether it becomes a piece of legislation, whether it becomes part of maybe a rulemaking at the PUC. I think that it might be a little bit early because I'd like to see what some of the other working groups start to come up with so that we can make sure that we're not running in contradiction to them. So the task force had 3 very discrete working groups that had some overplay, but not a lot. But with us, when you look at the working group on generation, transmission, and delivery, which is securing energy imports and exports, we have to make sure that if generation is going to be at a higher saturation of renewable resources, that we're ensuring the technology exists, for example, storage or, better inverters or whatever it is, that when we put more renewables onto the grid, that we're securing that grid transmission. So that's kind of how I sort of saw it as we start with some of these topics and then we work to figure out the recommendations on who would be in charge of them, what the costs would be, and then we kind of work with the other committees to blend them into a full set of recommendations out of the larger committee to the governor. And I don't know how anyone else feels about that, but that was the way I sort of saw it.
Yeah, okay. And that makes sense to me. So one comment and then another question. When I look at this list of 8 things, I think it's, from at least my perspective, it's pretty inclusive. 2 of the topics, incentive programs and new technologies, kind of seem to apply potentially to the other 6 or most of the other 6, and kind of a means to an end. And the other 6 look to me to be more like topics that would lead the conversation, where incentive programs and new technology in each of those areas might just fit in with those other 6. I don't know if I'm missing something there, but that's just kind of how I read it. And I think we kind of need to tackle all 6. I don't know that leaving any of those completely out of our conversation would make sense. And that's just kind of my thought on that subject. And then the other question I had was whether you thought it made sense to issue some kind of call to all the interested stakeholders in this conversation to provide their thoughts to the subcommittee by some date, so that we could gather and use it to our benefit, the expertise that's out there, and not just the expertise that we have individually on the committee.
I think that's a really great idea, Steve. Mr. Cherry, from the perspective of any open meeting law, is there a protocol that we could or should follow if we were going to put a call out to, again, as Steve suggested, all the interested in subject matter expert stakeholders for ideas or presentations? Is that something that has to be done in a particular format, if you know? Sorry to put you on the spot.
We're going to have to look into that and get back to you for future meetings. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. So we're going to have to look into that issue for you and get back to
Okay.
you. And we can do that at a subsequent meeting. And if that's the case, we can go as staff. We'll try and get that lined up so you guys can have a motion and move forward in a timely manner at the next meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And I'll just throw out that I think it would work if, Jennifer, you wanted to do that on your own without the subcommittee acting and having to wait until the next meeting to do so. I think any committee member acting on their own could ask for that information from stakeholders. We might want to check that as well. And if so, then you could move forward without us.
Okay, and then we could potentially put on a subsequent meeting discussion of recommendations from outside and interested stakeholders if that was a way to proceed.
Yeah, that you had brought back to the committee. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
But, you could check.
Okay, I'll work with staff on that.
I was just going to say, from an open meeting law perspective, you could take action on this agenda item now to say that you want to go out and notify prospective speakers for future meetings. They just, to actually get their presentations and things, the presentations need to be agendized on a future meeting for purposes of the open meeting law.
Okay, so council, then I understand that's a motion we can make under item 4 as possible action is to notify potential stakeholders of the opportunity.
Item number
Okay.
4 is possible action, possible action
Okay.
item, and it's items for future consideration. So I would think asking stakeholders to come in and make presentations would be something for future consideration.
All right, then could I get a motion from a member of the committee to have a solicitation to subject matter expert stakeholders for their suggestions on presentations for this working group to consider within that group of 8 categories?
Yeah, and
Is that
Adam, before you make a motion, could I just add that we also ask them to go ahead and present any written information or suggestions that they have, and not just confine it to a potential presentation, because it's, I think, kind of likely we'll get so many that, or we could get so many
Right.
that having a presentation from all might not work.
Well, and let me just make sure, let me ask counsel since she's on the phone. If we do that type of a solicitation, are we obligated then to let them all come and present?
I don't know that you necessarily are, but anything you receive written, to the extent that it's going to all the committee members, just needs to be made available to the public at the time that it's made available to committee members. But you could request written submissions as well.
Okay. All right, so then so let me make a different motion then, or make a request for a different motion, and that would be to have a solicitation to subject matter expert stakeholders to provide to this working group any written suggestions or ideas for moving forward with presentations and recommendations on the 8 categories listed in the agenda. Does that meet what you were looking for, Mr. Hill?
It does, yes, thanks.
Okay, so that would be my request for a motion.
Adam Kramer, for the record, I so motion.
Okay, so I've got a motion second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, great. All right, so then we'll put that call out there, and thank you very much for the suggestion. And we have to end this at 1, is that right, gentlemen? Who's got a conflict? I mean, sorry, not at 1, at 2.
Yeah, Jennifer, this is Steve. I've got a conflict at 2 that I've got a little flexibility on.
Okay, all right. Because what I'd like to do is just kind of keep talking through some of these categories and see. So, for example, Daniel said, let's see about the PUC doing a presentation. Adam suggested, it sounded like Mr. Wellinghoff doing a presentation. And I just want to see what other topical concerns or topical matters you guys think are the most appropriate for our next meeting. Because I really feel like our group has got so much to go through, and we're going to have to be so nimble when other committees start making their recommendations, that I want to try to start getting things slated and sort of plotted out for the next meeting that we have, which should be in August.
Jennifer, this is Steve. Might be helpful to have the State Office of Energy also make a presentation and just give us the portfolio of programs that are already in place.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Daniel, within the world of storage, since I think that that's going to be very key to more grid integration of renewables, is there Is there any company that might be doing storage that you know of? I'm not getting a laugh. Or, I mean, whether it's your company or another company, if you think that that's appropriate, to have someone come in and talk about that.
Yeah, so I think that I'd love some feedback from the rest of the group about this. Tesla is obviously very immersed within the energy storage sector, and so we have a lot of expertise that we can provide on the specific subject of storage. That said, there are other companies in that space, and that are sort of in different buckets, whether it's behind the meter or at the commercial level or even more at the industrial level. There's also the trade association, which could come in and give a broader overview, or another sort of trade group that's based around alternative energies. Like I'm thinking about AEE. I know has done some work around storage. There's also other companies that have been involved, and I'd point back to issue 4 aggregation programs. There's some specific companies that I'm aware of within California that actually testified on SB 204, the storage bill, that it expressed some desire that if the legislation did indeed pass, that they would locate or increase their presence in Nevada, and so they have some specializations around aggregation. I'm thinking of a company called Advanced Microgrid Solutions,
Right.
which again is based in California. They somewhere along that where you're looking at the potential leveraging different aspects of storage, just because it is such a versatile product. It could be interesting to have a couple of presentations all around the concept of storage and what its applications are, both in a more immediate sense, as well as perhaps more appropriately under the auspices of a retail choice-like environment.
Okay. And then within that sort of set of buckets, obviously you have a much more in-depth knowledge and understanding and sort of working concepts of storage than I do. But I also look at it as not just a grid infrastructure piece, but also a generation piece. Is that kind of one of the sets of buckets that you look at as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're looking at it especially again in the concept of aggregation, it doesn't energy storage, by virtue of what it is not technically a generator or a generating asset, but it can defer the need for additional generation assets. So it can fit under that sort of industrial bucket by virtue of that. And again, one of the things that is supposed to be done over the course of the next 9, maybe it's 12 months, again, via the PUC around the storage bill, is to really sort of tease out the different ways in which storage should be valued. Again, for this type of exact circumstance, where having a disaggregated amount of storage within a community may very well offset the need for the utility to procure additional generation assets. Finding ways to compensate consumers, certainly in a retail choice environment, or businesses who've made that capital investment in storage is I think, going to be a key point for us in terms of being able to address some of the concerns about what happens if we do end up going to a retail choice environment, and NV Energy no longer is a provider of last resort, and ultimately we're looking at trying to maintain the robustness of the grid that we have today.
Okay.
I don't know that robustness is a word, but
It's, I think that I get what you're saying, so can just make that a word. Do you think if we're gonna, I'm just thinking about time frames and what all we have to do, and I'm thinking it might make sense to possibly get one of the trade associations to be able to come and talk broadly about storage, and then if we need further breakdown, then maybe we bring in, a company or sort of a specialty group that can talk more specifically about it. Does that make sense to everybody?
again,
And again, I'm
Daniel,
going
for the
to
record, not
probably defer a
necessarily
lot to
looking
Dan.
not necessarily looking to dominate the conversation, but I think it may be worth having the trade group offer a very high level, I would suggesting more high level
Right.
sort of testimonial around all the different areas that storage can impact. If I'm not mistaken, if I recall from the pie chart, there's 13 different aspects of the grid which storage touches just by virtue with a single product, and so going into some level of detail about those different value streams could be a very good area for us to probe as a committee. But I might suggest that we do couple it with perhaps a case study from either a particular region. I'm thinking of Green Mountain Power in Vermont, which has put a bunch of power walls behind the meter to help promote some grid reliability. Or again, AMS, which touches a different part of the grid and acts as an aggregator. There are certainly plenty of others, and I don't mean to shortchange any particular group, but again, maybe offering something that's in not so conceptual, but rather something that's been instituted today and can show what might be achievable at an early phase might be appropriate as well.
Okay, I think that sounds great. So, so for the next meeting, we'll try to get presenters on storage, both from the trade group and a good example. And thank you for the suggestion on Green Mountain Power. Adam, is there anything? Well, we've got this sort of list of categories. So let's, if we're talking about, and I agree with you, Steve, that I think that we need to work through all of these, especially because they all have impacts on what the energy system looks like, what the market looks like, and what Nevada looks like from the perspective of what we've been asked to do, both in this committee and as an industry as a whole from the governor. So let's just kind of walk through this list, and if I could just kind of get some of your thoughts on how we might talk about them and how they might intersect with one another in terms of what we need to do for presentations and discussions with the actual implementation of these things. So as was pointed out, we've talked a lot about the fact that RPSs are compatible with an open market, have done well in open markets, and have been pretty robust in open markets. So I just kind of wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts on who might present or how you wanted the discussion to go on RPS. Again, I have some thoughts on that. Mostly, again, it would be that sort of high-level trade group, kind of a presentation to talk about what RPSs look like in other states that have open markets. But I'd love to hear from you guys as well.
This is Daniel. I honestly don't have a tremendous amount of opinions on this, but would certainly welcome your suggestions and see if that stimulates any conversation on it.
Okay.
This is Adam. I agree. We have no strong opinions on it. I think there's lots of great groups out there.
Okay, great. Then I will work with staff to do some outreach in addition to the solicitation that we do to some groups that I think could be helpful in that discussion. Is there anything else, Adam, in terms of grid infrastructure? Are there specifics besides having Mr. Wellinghoff come in and discuss his paper and some of his research that you think would be beneficial from the grid infrastructure perspective?
No, I think that the key to the focus has really got to be on the distribution part of the system, in addition to the grid, only in so much as it supports renewable energy being able to access the grid, being able to support new technologies to access the grid. And I just wanted to emphasize that point, because I think that that's really what's important as it relates to this subcommittee's task at hand and how we fit in there, and potentially, again, what the role, maybe the PUC even has an idea about this, as well as what their management of both the transmission and distribution. Obviously, transmission is more federally regulated, but distribution system may look like in their world as well when they do come in to speak with us.
Okay. All right. So for energy efficiency programs, we passed 2 great energy efficiency bills this session, or 3 actually, that touched on energy efficiency in some way. And I know that this has been a question that's been discussed in terms of who would handle energy efficiency programs if we don't have a vertically integrated utility. That sounds, based on what we've discussed, that sounds like something, again, maybe we could have the PUC discuss. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on where we could start that discussion about how to integrate some of those demand-side management, those energy efficiency programs into a new market?
This is Adam. I don't, but I was just thinking, when we do that kind of call for proposals and new ideas, and Daniel, maybe you can help us. I was thinking, what is the best way to push this out to the widest audience outside of Nevada as well? Because Jennifer, to the question you just posed, I wonder if there's technological solutions for this that we may not yet be aware of, but somebody is pretty advanced on or working through, and bring those kinds of people to the conversation and to the table.
Yeah, Adam, you raise a great point, and I fear that I don't have a terrific answer. These things do tend to have a way of finding their way into sort of messages that get sent out from trade groups to their entire listings, and there are probably ways for us to encourage that. Again, because I'm closest to it within the concept of energy storage, we're obviously talking about potentially involving the trade group. The trade group has a bunch of members, and I'm sure that as part of encouraging them to potentially participate in a presentation setting, they'd also have some interest in making sure that their membership was able to opine on this very topic. Aside from that, I'm coming up a little short on other suggestions.
Adam, that's what I would probably have suggested, is starting with the list of trade groups, and I think that between our collective networks, we probably have a pretty comprehensive depth of who's out there that can do that kind of work. So I think maybe let's put it out there and see what we get back. And this is going to be a long process. So if it takes 2 or 3 meetings to find that burgeoning technology or that burgeoning policy from another state that works with this on, say, energy efficiency, then we'll just kind of keep those proposals rolling in and then properly provide them to the public as they come in and into the committee. So aggregation programs, I know that there's already been an interest in from the folks from the community solar industry to have them come in and talk about how it looks in open retail markets. So were there any other thoughts from the rest of the working group on community solar and how we look at that given the specific amendment to the executive order? Because the language in the amended executive order is kind of broad. It just simply says that we're supposed to add into our discussion allowing community solar gardens to begin operating in Nevada. So I just wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts on that. Otherwise, again, I've got kind of a list of folks that have reached out to me already about being part of the discussion. Okay. So incentive programs is, again, kind of broad. I know that we have existing incentive programs for solar and for wind, but I'm wondering if it makes sense to talk about is there a time now to start seeing what other technologies or innovations should be supported through incentive programs, for example, like storage. And we've got the study going on at the PUC. There was some bill language about EVs and storage. And again, I'm sorry, Daniel, I know you keep saying you don't want to take the lion's share of it, but a lot of this is work that you're doing on the ground. So do you have any thoughts on talking about incentive programs through storage or other new tech, or do you feel like that kind of discussion can fall within those higher level presentations that we've already discussed?
Yeah, I thought that Steve Hill's comments were pretty instructive on this, and I tend to agree. When it comes to new technologies, it's very often they're often very early in their production. There's a clear a demonstrable benefit associated with the technologies, but they're not necessarily comparable to what has been tried and true for potentially decades and is sort of standard practice. I would use storage actually as an example for where the process is working itself out now, where we know that there are already areas on the grid for which storage can be viable without an incentive program. So I would caution us against assuming that every new technology that we're going to be discussing is going to require some kind of incentive. Certainly, there's the opportunity if we see it as being of such tremendous value that we may wish to, or for that matter, if we need to create a scenario by which a large number of these products find themselves into the market prior to any sort of upstart of retail choice, then using an incentive to provide a market indicator or to work with consumers, potentially in low-income areas and particular areas of interest to the legislature for sure, then we can do that. But I expect that conversation will emerge as we discuss the larger topics, and invariably create a scenario by which we create a sort of a consequence of any sort of endorsement of a technology. If we want this technology, if we deem this technology to be extremely important to the success of an open retail market, then the legislature should in fact consider catalyzing in the immediate future in order to make sure that it is in abundance prior to the entrance, for instance.
Okay. All right. That makes sense, and thank you for reminding me of what Steve had said. On new technologies, so I think I said it at the beginning, but I want to make sure that we're looking at not just what we have now, but what we might have, what's coming up next. And I know that a couple of the things that are on my radar are, again, transportation electrification and autonomous vehicles. Whether I don't know that has anything to do with what our open retail market looks like, but certainly transportation electrification does potentially, and then smart cities and microgrids. And so within that realm of new tech, if there's anything else that you all think is within a category, let me know. Or if you have any comments on any of those categories, it'd be great if you could weigh in real quickly. I want to be very respectful of
Daniel Witt, for the record. The only thing that I would point out, and what we hear at Tesla very often, is that utilities increasingly look at electric vehicles as a new load opportunity, and so the promotion of electric vehicles within a state, by which you increase the amount of load, while that potentially should be looked at as an area of interest in terms of it should be looked at as an area of interest in terms of serving that load, and may in fact be enticing to new retail providers coming in if they know that there's a healthy electric vehicle market with consumers that are going to be sucking up a lot of power. So it's probably worth a little bit of discussion in terms of how Nevada could potentially market itself to potential retail providers.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Daniel. Okay. And then just quickly, if anyone had thoughts on additional thoughts that may not have come up already on demand-side management or DER, I think distributed energy resources, and especially rooftop solar, is something that we're going to need to look at and make some recommendations and do some analysis on, because of how different it may be in Nevada if there's not a utility to support those rooftop contracts. If there's not a PLR, we've got other models like in Texas. So I don't know if it's worth having folks come in to just talk about what the programs look like in different states as potential models, knowing again that we're the first state that's done this in a very long time, and things have changed so much that in some ways we're starting from a blank slate. But I just kind of wanted to get a sense from all of you about DER and rooftop in terms of what you would want to have brought forward to be able to make, to recommend policies for both wholesale and retail that and considerations of that type.
Daniel, for the record, the one thing that I and someone should fact check me on this, but I'm under the impression that in the version of the legislation for AB 405 that that was passed and signed by the governor, that there is some language in there that addresses the issue of what happens to NEM customers in the event that the market transitions to a retail choice environment. Steve Hill may be able to check me on this, but specifically, I think what it says, or at least we discussed in concept, was the notion that that as a retail market was set up, those new providers would be essentially distributed all of the existing NEM customers that had been grandfathered into date on some kind of some kind of even basis between the different providers, and that in fact, in order to come into the market and to serve the market, they would have to take on those customers. But we should probably clarify that to make sure what I'm saying is in fact accurate.
Yeah, I tried to.
Yeah, I think the legislation allows some flexibility in how that would take place, but that was the way you described that is the intent.
Glad to know my memory is still good after 2 weeks.
And Daniel, I looked at it a few days ago and had the same sort of impression, even though I wasn't working as much on 405 this session. But I just want to make sure that there's not some specific provision out of there or some specific flexibility or gap that we shouldn't be discussing as we move forward too. So to make sure that the intent of the legislation is met through any recommendations out of this committee.
That makes good sense to me.
Okay. I think that basically covers our list of categories. And so what I have for the next meeting is that we'll craft up a solicitation for folks to prepare send out to stakeholders, and then for the next meeting we will work on potential presentations from the PUCN, the Governor's Office of Energy. Possibly a quick discussion about what the Interim Energy Committee is going to be working on. I would like to try to have that high-level storage discussion if we can do it, and then possibly based on his availability, I'm sure, see what Mr. Wellinghoff may be able to come in and talk to us about. I think that sounds like a roundup of the presentations that we discussed. Does that sound like a workable plan for the next committee meeting?
Chair.
I mean, obviously it's a lot. I'm not saying we'll do all of those, but that's sort of what we'll start to target. Yes, Mr. Cherry?
Hey, before we move forward, I want to make sure that I think, Rosalie, the way we craft that statement, we don't have to do anything future. We can move forward as staff and put that solicitation out between meetings, so you don't have to bring it up or wait till the next meeting. Rosalie, are you on the line still?
Yes, I am.
Will you confirm that that's the case for us, please?
Yeah, I think that would be fine. That staff, I mean, you made a vote that you wanted to look for that, so essentially the working group has directed staff to do that. So you can move forward as staff to look for it, and anybody who's going to make a presentation, put it on your next agenda. To the extent that you're going to distribute any materials to the working group, just make sure those are available to the public at the same time.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Mr. Cherry. All right, is there anything else, gentlemen? Otherwise, it's 2:07, and I know the time frames were tight this time, so I want to be respectful of that. Okay. With that, then, I will close item number 4 and move to item number 5, public comments and discussion. Is there anybody in Las Vegas wishing to make a comment to this working group? No. And how about in Carson City? Any members of the public wishing to address this committee?
Yes, there is. Good afternoon. Fred Volz for the record. My concern with the actions of the committee go back to the new Energy Industry Task Force. And while there were many recommendations issued last year, not one of them had any sort of cost, and I'm talking about the raw costs to ratepayers and taxpayers, both in this state and federally, to implement those. So as this working group goes forward, as well as the overall committee, it would seem incumbent on any recommendations that might be finally offered up to offer that cost component. And more importantly, I would suggest that there are 3 entities that could help calculate that. It might have to be a range because you wouldn't know all the variables, but it would be the Governor's Office of Energy, GOED, and the Public Utilities Commission working in league with one another to arrive at that number so that intelligent policy decisions can be made going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Volz. Anybody else? Okay. With that, I will close out item number 5. And then if I could get a motion to adjourn, if I could get a motion to adjourn on this meeting from one of my committee members, that'd be great.
So moved. This is Steve.
Second? Thank you, Mr. Hill. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you guys so much for all your work today. And we are adjourned. Thanks.